indeed start. Hello from the Kindertransport Association from New York City.
Hello,
right.
Melissa.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Good. Well, a very warm welcome to everybody listening in on this lovely sunny evening. This, as you may be aware, is the third event in a series of 14 very diverse topics being discussed in the course of the next 2 weeks, taking place under the aegis of the Insiders Outsiders Festival, which I was the initiator and the director of, and that officially went on from March last year to March this year, rather sort of brutally curtailed by the you-know-what in March. But I was really delighted to discover almost sort of accidentally that, of course, you know, the lockdown has opened up some unexpected opportunities for different ways of communicating. And one of them, of course, is by means of Zoom and online programs such as this one. So we've just had some messages coming in from the other side of the pond, the other side of the Atlantic. Wonderful. So a big warm welcome to everybody, wherever you are. I will just say before I forget that as well as this event, last nights were both music focused events. This one obviously is a literary event. The one at 8 p.m, which some of you may be interested in signing up to if you haven't yet done so, is on the Oppermanns, a 1933 recently rediscovered, reissued novel by the great German novelist Leon Feuchtwanger. Should be extremely interesting as well. And then on the Monday the 27th of this month at, well, I can't remember, but it will be online. There'll be an interesting and very, well, different but related presentation about the poet Beata Duncan, led by her son, who is also a poet, Stephen Duncan. So watch out for those. Very good. A few practicalities before I introduce the two participants. I think most of you by now know the ropes when it comes to Zoom. Everybody's been muted. I'm afraid you're not going to be able to pipe up verbally, but if you have any questions, and I very much hope you will do, address them to, well, they'll come through to me through the Q&A, not the chat, but the Q&A function, which is just left of center on the bottom of your screens. And I imagine that'll be pretty straightforward for everyone. It's set on speaker view, so you will be seeing us, particularly Gaby and Jonathan, only. I would also just like to conclude here by saying a very, very warm thank you to the Jewish Book Week people, particularly Claudia Rubenstein, for agreeing to partner on this event. So, to cut to the chase, let me start by introducing Jonathan, and I will tease him ever so slightly, because when I asked him for a biography, he rather sort of cryptically said, oh, well, you just say I'm a playwright and professor of drama at the University of Essex, and that this, The Berlin Shadow, is his very first book, and that in a way does sum it up. But I'd like to just elaborate, Jonathan, if I may, ever so slightly. He is currently a professor in the Department of Literature, Film and Theatre Studies at Essex University. And I think you've been associated, haven't you, Jonathan, with Essex for quite a long time, since the mid-1990s in one capacity or another. Some of you may have come across Jonathan as a playwright, and if I may, I'll just quickly run through the names of some of his most important plays, and perhaps we'll later on have the opportunity to make some connections between his life, his work as a playwright, and his current publication. His first one was at the First Jonathan in 2004, The Pull of Negative Gravity, was shown at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, did extremely well, and others followed, Memory, and then one called Darkness, and Rig 83. He's had 2 attachments at the National Theatre, etc., etc. His radio plays, he's worked in that capacity too, include Moving the Scrolls and Human Rights. And this, his first prose, his first book, The Berlin Shadow, subtitled, as I'm sure you'll be aware, Living with the Ghosts of the Kindertransport, is published on the 6th of August, so you are privileged to have a kind of preview, a taster of this very fine publication, published in this country by Scribner, Elias, Simon and Schuster, and Little Brown in the US, and Surkamp in Germany. And Gaby and I were both saying how very impressed we are that it's already been scheduled to be translated into several languages: Italian, German, Dutch, and Danish. Wonderful. I'll say a few words very briefly about Gaby, who's going to take over really from me in a minute and be Jonathan's interlocutor, if that's the word. Gaby grew up in Cardiff. There's a Welsh connection, which you will hear more about shortly. Studied at the University of Sussex. She's a journalist, filmmaker, and producer with credits across a broad range of factual television. In 2001, it's worth mentioning, she staged the first ever national event to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day. She started writing her to date only her debut novel, Reparation, while doing a master's degree in creative writing at City University in London, where it won a prize and was later longlisted for the Bath Novel Award. She continues to work as a television series producer and freelance print journalist while working on a second novel, and I hope we'll have a chance, Gaby, to hear a little bit, just perhaps, about that. Very good. So bear in mind, direct questions through the Q&A function, and without further ado, and with great pleasure, I will hand over to actually Jonathan, first of all, to read us some preliminary excerpts from his new book.
Thank you so much, Monica. I ring, he answers. You want to go? Yes. He falls silent. There's a long gap. The trip might help you sleep. I doubt it. How is it? What? Your sleep. He falls silent again. It must be alarming. What? Not being able to sleep. I've never been able to sleep. Perhaps the journey will help your nightmares. Perhaps it'll make my nightmares worse. But you want to go? Yes. And so I organise it. The trip, the dates, the ferry, the tickets, the car, the route, the passports, the hotel. Later I ring again. We're going to do your original journey in reverse. In reverse? We're going to go backwards. Backwards? We're going to go to Berlin from here. And then we'll come back. I didn't go back. I know that. Mine was a one-way ticket. He laughs. We'll try to find where your father's shops were. And my father's grave, of course. And the station. The station too. There. It has been agreed I will walk the pavements with him. Together we will breathe the air of the city that ripples its past through his daily life and the corners of his children's lives, the rivulets of its history draining into us, the gutters carrying the rain and wash of its streets, its twisted papers, its yellowed stars, its broken glass, its ash, its father's grave, the station, the shop. And that's the beginning. And this is the picture of the shop which we had to track down. So that's the opening of the book.
Very powerful opening, Jonathan. Before, I know you want to read a little bit more, but before you do so, I just wondered if we could just have a quick, so I think people have gathered from the reading that you've just done that this is the story of a trip you made to Berlin with your father, and that you retrace in reverse the journey he took as a 12-year-old boy on the Kindertransport. But it's a more complex narrative than that suggests. It's, you know, it cuts back and forwards to your childhood. And it tells a lot about your father's emotional state of mind, I'd say. Why do you think it took you so long to decide to go on that journey with your father?
It's a great question. And I was surprised actually that we ever did it, because we had done it once when I was 13. We'd gone to East Berlin, he and I together, but we hadn't really got on as father and son very well at all. And so I think the idea of tracing back his past was something he really did not want to do. And it's something that I really did want to happen. But I didn't realize, you know, when you're young, you don't realize how important it's going to be, your father's history to you. So very, very late, actually, and very fortuitously, we made this trip, him in his 80s and me in my 50s. And I at the time, I felt the reason it took so long is because neither of us could bear it. We couldn't bear the risk. It's a very, very emotionally high risk journey. It had the possibility, which I mentioned in the book, of really facing material which is just too painful to look at, and which there seemingly is, there's no need to look at it. There's no need really to dig up things which have been put to bed a long time ago, or we think they've been put to bed a long time ago. So I think, if that answers your question, we didn't get on, and we couldn't, neither of us could bear the risk of it, I think.
And part of the issue, I think, is that your father had suppressed such a lot.
Yeah.
And he hadn't spoken about it. Now, there's another little section that I think we discussed a little bit earlier, that where you describe your father gathering up the ashes from the range. And I wonder if you could read that, because it's such a powerful image.
Well, thanks. It takes, it's 3 pages. I grew up in Wales, like Gaby, and I grew up in a cold house. And this cold house had a coal cellar. And every morning, my father used to take out the clinker, the ashes, and I didn't realise how symbolic this was, but I shall now read it. And the name of the house was called Kai Hafrith. Kai Hafrith was a dark house and full of ice in winter, so that in the mornings the thin glass of the windows was crazed with frost on the inside, and occasionally strange noises passed through it during the night. It had high stairs, which curved, and an attic. It was our new semi-detached house on Pentrosfer. Pentrosfer was a road that was different to any I had experienced before, bumpy and cratered and wide. It exuded space, and looking out from the window of our front room, the other side of the road seemed far away. Pentrosfer was an unmade road, a bastard road of cantankerous humps and angry stones. It was as though it had been built as an act of malice, impeding progress rather than advancing it. And my father's solution to its array of broken surfaces was simple. Every morning, he placed ashes and clinker, the waste from our coal-burning range, into its melancholy crevices. It was a ritual. First, he would sweep up the cockroaches that ran around our black slate kitchen floor onto a steel shovel. Then he would open the door of our coal-fired range and throw them into its dark red interior. Before he threw them, the cockroaches could desperately but noiselessly try to scrabble up the shovel's cold steel shaft, their mute keratin legs flailing, entangled with each other, crossed and interwoven and jerking and frantic as they slipped back down the shovel's shaft and then further over its scoop as they attempted to escape the glowing flames behind them. But their struggles were futile. Although 1 or 2 dropped off the shovel and raced away, most entered hell in reverse. Having burnt them, my father would throw some more coal from the coal scuttle into the fire, close its door, and remove the stove's tinder box. This was full of the ashes of cockroaches and the burnt coal that had kept the stove alight overnight. He would carry these ashes into the road, dressed only in a towel, wrapped like a sarong around his waist. This brief outfit was mandatory, regardless of the weather, and neither sun nor rain nor even thick snow deterred him. Often, as he began to fill the hole, a gust of wind would whip up, so that a cloud of fine ash with its swirling flecks of pearl would momentarily envelop him as he placed the ashes into the crevices, bent and concentrated and smoothed them with his hands. For a split second, he resembled a crouching apparition, the ashes of cockroaches and coal enveloping him and brushing his skin and entering his lungs. The road took many years to fill, and my father's journey naturally extended as he smoothed it. He had started at our back door, and after a couple of years had successfully evened out the small road behind our house. Then he had to move further afield, and so progressed into the centre of Pentrosfer, where, particle by particle, he rebuilt it, filling holes, levelling bumps, easing journeys, the reparation of ashes. He was good to the road, and the road, by accepting his ministrations, in turn was good to him.
I'd forgotten you'd used that word reparation, because it's like an act of reparation.
It is, yeah, it's reparation, and that, which is your book, your book, Reparation. And I think these strange physical actions which it takes, in order to repair without realizing it. You don't realize you're governed in a way. The unconscious is a very, very powerful thing, and you don't quite know why you're doing these things. But you could see the repairing of a road and the repairing of himself going on.
But so, as you were a child, your father's behaviour, I mean, that's one example. It is eccentric, I suppose. Seems eccentric.
Yeah.
But, I mean, tell me if I'm going too far here, but some of the actions that you describe in your book, some of the behaviours, are borderline abusive, you know, the way he drives and stuff like that. It's very definitely, I mean, do you think, you know, was he considered odd, or how did you think of your father as you were growing up? Because, you know, obviously you're writing with the hindsight of an adult.
Oh, I just adored my father. I was frightened by him, but I looked up to him, and I thought that he was a rather remarkable person. And I think that I sort of understood that some souls or some people have bright lights around them. And I think I can see this in your mother as well, you know, that there's some aspect of big characters who survive things which just makes them larger than life. I mean, so I never really experienced it as, I experienced it as something that I couldn't quite live up to. Because, you know, I think we talked about it last time we chatted about fearlessness. And one of the things I really loved about my father was he was fearless. And I wasn't. I was scared and timid. So curiously, it was later, it took me a long time to recognize that sort of attitude of absence of sensitivity, the sort of collapse of unfeelingness in order to be fearless. You know, the downside of fearlessness is if you don't feel fear, you can often excise a whole emotional range, which is to do with tenderness and kindness and gentleness and connectivity. So those aspects got lost. But as I was growing up, I didn't realize I wasn't getting them. Later on, I realized. And I think, I mean, it's not like we fought. We just sort of drifted apart, I think, my father and I. And I think I really felt that I had to find and inhabit these areas, these emotional areas, which had been lost to me. I mean, as a man growing up, what was I meant to be? And I was timid and he was fearless, and it was really hard work.
So I can totally see that, because you say, I mean, he was in the SAS and he parachuted into Malaysia and he ran marathons in his 60s, and so he 70s, was quite a local hero. You know, he was a local GP, which I don't know what it's like now, but certainly growing up in our community in South Wales, the local GP was you know, really
he was a very conscientious doctor, and a very good doctor as far as I can tell. I mean, people would often talk, I say this in the book, people would often stop me in the street and say, "Thank you so much, please say thank you to your father," and they would mean it. You know, it was like, so he did have this sort of but I think the thing about my dad is he was unconventional. He was his own person. He didn't follow mob rule. He would just do what he wanted to do, and that's incredibly admirable. And I think what we're talking about in this whole collection, which Monica's, you know, so brilliantly put together, really, which is this kind of almost ferocious contribution to society. You know, I mean, my father, you know, people would say to him, "I'd like to be a private patient." He said, "Well, no, I work for the NHS, so I don't have private patients." And he was resolute about this contribution to the social function which saved him. And I think this feeling of being blessed and saved really entered him very deeply and very profoundly. And the aspects of his character of bravery and fearlessness were used for social, I don't want to be too grand about it, but, you know, he wanted to help. He was a doctor, so he liked to be a doctor. So that makes...
Personally, he could, I mean, from the way you describe him, be quite abrasive.
Well, I was the oldest son, and he's very abrasive, my dad. Yeah, he was kind of, he was abrasive, but he was sort of fun. He was just very alive. I mean, he's so embarrassing to hang around him. I mean, as a kid, I was just hugely embarrassed. I think, again, your mum, you know, you just, I really recognize that with your mum, that you become, it's really, really weird, because you're the child, but in some ways you're more whole than the damaged parent. And so you oscillate between being the child, the kind of vulnerable child at the mercy of the parent, and also, really weirdly, being the parent to the child. you know, so I could see when my father would upset people. And so I'd find myself at 11, 12 saying, oh, he doesn't mean it, don't worry, you know, it's all right. He's not really being rude. He's just, you know, full of himself. So we couldn't really go to cafes because my father would walk in and say, I want you to turn the music up, down. And he would be 1 foot inside the cafe. And if there's any music, he would say, I want you to turn the music, and we'd all the children go, it's quite nice to have some music. So he was really funny like that. So yeah, I didn't experience him. I can see when I was writing, I mean, one of the things I found so difficult writing it out, as they say, which I know you've done too, you know, this kind of writing it out. You think, wow, I didn't realize quite that I went through that. And so I think writing the book became quite a sort of marathon of its own kind, really.
You see it from a completely different perspective.
You do,
it is
don't
the
you?
difference, I think, of the sort of adult gaze and the child gaze.
Yeah.
But you don't write very much about your mother's
my
attitude to all this.
Yeah.
And how she coped with your father's sometimes eccentric behaviour.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a really good question, and you alluded it to before, and I think the sadness, my sister died, and that not my mum, and I mentioned that in my book. And there we were in mid Wales, and there was no such thing as this kind of emotional palette which wasn't available to people. You know, it was difficult to discuss things. And I think my mum, I'm very close to my mum, and I think she features in the book at very key moments in the book. Because when you said it, I thought, yeah, she is sort of the descriptor of it. But the other thing was that I really wanted to write about me and my father, and it became almost like an obsession because I was reconfiguring what I felt about my father, both as a lovingness and also a sadness about what, you know, I mean, it's odd to feel sad about what you went through, but I did feel a bit sort of aware that I was discovering things really while I was doing the writing. So I really felt, because the other thing is, you know, you're a writer, I'm a playwright who has written a book, and the thing with the play is you keep focused. This is about me and my father. This is about post-traumatic stress disorder. This is about the absolute sort of reality of emotions, unspoken emotions getting passed down. And I felt in the end, I've got 3 children, and which you know, we talked about. I didn't want to pass anything. Well, you know, I just wanted to pass as little as I possibly could down to my children. I felt that my job, and it felt like a huge job, my job was to write it down as I experienced it, in order for it to be out loud and said. And I felt that this was one way, as we know from Freud and co. This is just one way of alleviating the possibility of passing on these traumas. So trauma, your parents' trauma gets passed down to you, you don't know what to do with it, and you pray that you don't pass it on. But you have to do more than pray, you have to write it out. And I think that in the end, that's why I wrote the book.
So let's talk a bit more about the journey, because obviously the people listening to this, unlike me, haven't had the privilege of reading your fantastic book. So talk us through a little bit about what happened. And I know there's a bit you want to read to us about one of the sort of really critical points when you are actually in Berlin with your dad.
I think one of the amazing things about the journey is that we both sort of, I became more dopey and my father became more sort of, you know, how he used to be. I mean, I have a perfectly, you know, respectable job, but somehow in his company, I would sort of fall back and I'd lose things and trip over and, you know, and I kept getting lost. It was very odd. I just lost, and I'm sure it was just anxiety. And he would be sitting there saying, oh my God, you're just useless. How do you manage to keep a job going? You know, it's just, you can't even find your way from A to B. And then as the journey went and progressed, so, and this is what I wanted to write, as the journey moves really to the heart of darkness, and we're talking Conradian notions of journeys and the Odyssean ideas of moving towards, as you move towards the darkness, so things become difficult. And my father started to have terrible nightmares. I started to lose even more things. The hotel we sort of descended into something of a silence, which I talk a lot about, this sort of very rich and full up, almost not violent silences, but very loud silences, you know. And so, yeah, so as we moved from Germany, and as we crossed the border from Holland to Germany, so my father tensed, and then we stopped off at a station, and then where he'd got off as a train, and then we moved into Berlin, and we just kind of found these places where he had left from. And I think the other thing which we're talking about, which we mentioned, Gaby, was that his mantra is, I am lucky, I am lucky, I was so lucky, because he was. And I think this inability to say anything other than I was lucky really was also an emotional kind of contradiction. At no point did he ever say on that journey, I was unlucky. He's just said, I was lucky. And I think that mantra, which I grew up with, you know, I just take my hat off to him, really, because it's a very admirable way to live your life, is to just reiterate how lucky you were. But it stops you looking at the unluckiness of things or the sadness of things, I think.
So read us a bit about you. There's a key moment. I think it's you go to your grandfather's grave, don't you?
Yeah, I've got this bit where I go to my grandfather's grave.
I don't know if you mentioned this, but should we say that your grandfather committed suicide?
My grandfather committed suicide,
yeah.
And then suicide turns out to be a big thing, which we find out in the book, and accounts for some of the difficulties which I encountered myself. But I had to find this out during the journey. So the journey was a massive education for me. And this is a short reading, and we don't know where my father's never been to his father's grave. And so we go looking for his grave. And this is us looking for his grave. And it's all very overgrown, and I'm very short-sighted, and I can't see very well. So I'm looking at all these gravestones. And we're in the Jewish graveyard in Weissensee. And this is the second biggest graveyard, Jewish cemetery in Europe. It's got 112,000. So it's taking a long time to find. We've got a map, but we still can't find it. So here we go. At the head of one of the rows, I find the grave of my father's father, my grandfather, Walter Lichtenstein. The sight catches me. Seeing his name in letters on a grave makes me suddenly transparent. My head spins, my limbs weaken. It's here, I say. My father walks over and joins me, quietening at the sight of his father's grave, seemingly all of a sudden tranquil and even serene. His feet placed evenly apart on the ground, the weight of his body on the soles of his feet, connected to the stabilizing earth. I pass my father 2 of the stones I've been carrying in my pocket from Wales. I bought these from outside your house, I say. I place 2 small stones upon Walter's grave. My father places 2 stones next to them. There we are, says my father. I hope it makes you feel better. It does, I say. It's a relief. I'm glad about that, he says, grace shining from him. I want to say out loud, how does it make you feel? But it's too crass a question, too violent in its simplicity. It would require from him a verbal answer that is impossible to cohere. It would require a pinning down. And anyway, it frightens me to think about what might happen if he began to answer it. For the answer could unravel my father's carefully constructed facade. His facade might fall away to reveal the thing that is within him, the thing that inhabits his intestines and his stomach, the thing that, if it did emerge into the light, would whimper and then destroy him, as well as those around him. It would do so immediately and without conscience. It is a terror that he carries inside himself, the most terrible thing. It must not be allowed out. He will not let it. We all know it's there. It's what I hear during his nightmares. It's what I see in his bitten nails. It's what his eyes reveal. It must not be uncovered. He will not have it. and nor will I let him. His decision to take his own suffering all the way to his own grave, unspoken, is a devout act, a mitzvah. And this is a picture of my father putting a stone on the grave.
It's difficult to follow that, so I'm going to make a complete leap now and ask you, I want to talk about national identity because it is something you touch on in the book.
Yeah.
Did your father regard himself as being German or being British? I mean, I asked that partly because it was a big issue in my household when I grew up. Did he speak with an accent in English? And you also, for one moment, you say that you wrote that he was very hostile to the idea of German cars.
Yeah.
And then...
Yeah.
Oh,
Right.
Gaby, we've frozen. Oh dear.
Well, can I answer the question anyway?
Yeah.
Monica, shall I?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Gaby,
assuming you can hear this, Gaby.
I've come back.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I used to say, because people used to say to me when I grew up, I mean, it wasn't a very sophisticated environment because I was often called the Nazi in the school, and people would sort of hail Hitler as I walked into class and things like that. So it's like quite complicated to tell people, no, you don't understand. You've got it very, very wrong.
That's so weird. I had exactly the same experience. Really? So my dad was from Berlin.
It's strange, isn't it? Well, there you go. You're the first person I've met who's been, a Jewish kid who's hailed as a Nazi. So there you go. It was very complicated. And so I used to say to my father, where are we? Who are we? And he'd say, you're Welsh. And I'd say, but Lichtenstein's not a Welsh name. He said it will be. So he was very, very, very keen that we would be Welsh. And it took a long time to work out that was quite a complicated thing. So people would say to me, where are you from? I'd say, Wales. Are you Welsh? Yes. People say, no, you're not Welsh. So I think that he felt not German, but British. And so the wipeout of the German prehistory. I mean, he really never, it was mentioned in the book, he never talked about his childhood. It is as though he was never a child, is what I say. And I think that sort of sense really of me trying to work out, I mean, in the book I allude to this, that he experienced the death of his childhood. When he got on the train, his childhood stopped and he never, ever referred to it, not once. And so I would ask questions because I'm a writer, so I wanted to know, and he would say, stop it. Why are you so worried? Stop talking about it. And I think this thing of identity was something which, we use the word ambivalence very freely, but that idea of an ambivalent identity wasn't very open to him. He wanted to be Welsh. He was certainly British and wanted really to be, I think he felt Welsh, actually. He loved Wales.
Yeah.
He absolutely...
Was it a conscious decision to choose Wales as somewhere to settle? Wales as opposed to England, say?
There was a lot of anti-Semitism around in the 50s when there was to become a GP. So it's quite hard to to get a GP. But yeah, he wanted to go to Wales. He wanted to go to the countryside. I think he would have gone to England if he'd found a place. But primarily, he was in a kind of heaven in a way in Wales, which was then a different. It was a different time and it was very, very isolated. It's pretty poor and beautiful, absolutely. Nature envelops it's the Brecon. It's just north of the Brecon. It's north of the Brecon Beacon. You're there. I mean, it's an exquisite land. It's a county called Radnorshire. It's now called Powys, but the old thing, and the really, really interesting, I refer to it in the book, is it's not actually a part of Wales, it's become a part of Wales, but originally it's a set of lands between England and Wales, which had its own laws and its own rules. It's called the Welsh Marches. And the Welsh Marches were not, under English or Welsh rule. And so they attracted a whole kind of culture of people outside this culture. And it's a very it's a wonderful place. I mean, it's a very, very beautiful place. And I go back there as much as I can. And my parents, you know, until my dad died, till 2 years before he died, he lived there. So it was really a very powerful landscape, a very moving and very powerful landscape. And it really is healing, I think. You know, to be in that beauty, that sort of constant, the constant embrace of natural beauty is very healing, I'd say.
Well, I've been driving through it today, so
yeah.
you know, sitting now not that far from Lampeter, so
Yeah.
I totally get that. You write, just to move on a bit, you write very movingly about your own feelings of depression, which you describe in quite a visceral way. It had an effect, it sounds like it had a very profound effect on your early life. You left school to work on a remote farm, living in what sounds quite a sort of rough, isolated life. It sounds though you're punishing yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It felt, I mean, looking back, I was, I didn't know at the time. I don't know. I think I was on an adventure, and I think looking back, the adventure was the engagement, and to look squarely at depression. I didn't know it. I didn't understand it, but I knew that I had not really engaged with myself. And I've come to think of depression, which I did experience and still do, as a space. I mean, a lot of writers do, a lot of artists do, as a space which has to be confronted. And if you can bear it, and it's not very nice bearing it, but if you can bear it, it has an enrichment in it, and it has a power in it. And it's usually repressed anger or repressed sense of oneself. And so as one moves through life, so one wants different things in life, and one changes, and you know, you have to engage with what life comes towards you. It just swamps you. And yeah, I had to really get myself out of a big depression, but I had some wonderful people who helped me. And so I was very lucky, very, very lucky.
Well, so I was going to come on to that because
yeah,
in the book you do describe this period in your life, but I know that you're now professor at Essex University, and obviously you're a successful playwright, as Monica gave us the details. But in the book, by and large, you do portray yourself as a bit of an emotional wreck. And I think you sort of earlier did explain a little bit why that was. It's partly to do with the dynamic of your relationship with your father. But to me, there's a bit of a missing link between the kind of isolated young 20-something who was working on a remote farm and your current position. So how did you actually, you must have pulled yourself out of that somehow. You got the strength from somewhere.
It's a very good question. When I say, you know, Monica says, what do you do? And I say, I'm a professor. I just can't quite believe it. You know, I just think, God, really? I find it quite difficult to say, actually. So it's most unexpected. I've been a professor for 6 or 7 years. So until then, I was a lecturer. Before that, I was a theatre director. And I did kind of go around a lot. So I think I must have had that strength, but I married a very special person, and I also met a very wonderful psychotherapist, and those two things saved me, really. I think if I hadn't had them, I would probably not, I certainly wouldn't have written this book, and I would not have been able to sort of compassionately deal with this wall in front of me, which I feel, you know, which is the purpose of really the book and this discussion, and the theme of Monica's thing is, what is our generation left with these remarkable survivors? These people are remarkable. I put my father within a group of people who are remarkable. And when we look at the Inside or Outside Festival, and we look at what people are contributing, and we look at what survivors bring, I see myself as part of as less remarkable, but at the end of something on the receiving end of someone very remarkable. And I felt it was my duty in a way to engage with that. So in some ways, depression was left to me and I must deal with it. And of course, my father, and my wonderful father, was also went through his depressions, and the way to get through depression is to work. And work is the great saving thing for depressives. You work, and that's really helped me too. And I learned that from him. If you're down, you get up. And so I did lots of things. And of course, the other thing about fighting depression is it kind of makes you close to yourself. If you admit you're a bit depressed, then you kind of, you work. There's a substrate inside you which you work with.
And I feel somehow that journey that was part of the work that you did, that it was a natural continuation on from the work you did to deal with your own depression, that there's something very, very cathartic about going on that journey. Do you think the fact that you were planning to write a book about it at the time, I mean, I suppose I should ask a question, were you planning to write a book about it at the time?
I wasn't planning to write a book on it at all. I thought by this stage in my life, I'd got over all this. You know, I'd sort of worked it all out. I felt happy-ish, I was successful. I didn't feel the need to go back at all. It was only afterwards that I thought, I'm going to write this. And I thought I was going to write a film and I couldn't make it into a film. So I thought, it's too multi-layered, it's too complicated. It's like your book, it's a lot of things you've got to kind of hold. And so the book and prose seemed to be the way of the container being able to collect up all this information. So no, I didn't know I was going to write it. And as I think I told you, it was a 5 or 6 day trip and 5 or 6 years to write those 5 or 6, 5 or 6 years to write those 5 or 6 days, basically.
Now, I know lots of people do want to ask questions. So I'm going to, I mean, I have a large number of questions left myself that I'd like to ask you, but I'll just ask another couple, and then I know Monica's going to take over and pass on the questions that have been already recorded. One of the things that really intrigues me about the book is how carefully you've researched lots of things about, and I mentioned this to you before, that there's a big contrast between this very powerful emotional narrative, but then it's as though the facts are very important as well. The weight of the ferry, or the power of the ferry engine that you take, or the fact that Liverpool Street Station is 30 foot below ground level. I know that all the time. I didn't know that. Why, in your mind, what was the role of that research?
Yeah, you brought this up before. I mean, frighteningly, that's my mind, and I have to. And my editor said, "You can't put all this detail." I was going, "Oh, I can," because I had about 5 pages on the ferry engine. That is just the way my mind works. But I am really interested in the way detail holds and contains emotion, and I think that one of the things when you are in a heightened state, and you are in a kind of a state of sort of I don't know, heightened state anyway, you become more acutely aware of detail. So I think that in many ways the journey seemed to me very acutely detailed because I was in quite a heightened emotional state. But that said, my mind does seem to have this kind of delight in minuscule detail.
It does work as to my mind, as a great foil to the kind of emotional narrative that's going on.
Well, I think the spiritual beauty is found in small things, isn't it? So I'm saying really that the details of the world are sort of magical, really, and when you find out that, I don't know how many horsepower was the ship is, something like 33,000, I can't remember how many, 98,000 horses or something. I mean, it's just a phenomenal number of horses if you think about it.
Yeah. So before we hand over to the questions, just one last. So did you write about your father's death in the book, but did he get an advance? Did he get to read anything that you'd written?
No, he didn't, sadly.
And what about the rest of your family? Have they?
They read some of it. Yeah, read bits. They'll read it soon. I mean, it's Wittgenstein says, you have to write as though no one's looking, not even yourself. And I think that's the best advice. And if you once you start showing it, you're doomed. And if you just can't, I can't anyway. You can, but I just cannot show it because I'm just too susceptible to people saying, "Oh, I like that bit," or "I don't like that bit," or "I don't like that bit." And I had a fantastic editor and a fantastic agent, Jonathan Conway, and who was my agent, and I had two editors, Chris White and Rowan Cope, and those three people were incredibly helpful in steering the structure. So I had enough help like that. And I felt that I wanted it to be, you know, just freed up. So it wasn't, you know, I showed it, if he was still alive, I'd be very happy to show it to him. But I had to complete it because it was I felt it was a duty for a second gen. It was the only thing I could do to contribute, really, which was to be as honest as I possibly could about what it's like to be the child of to be the child of someone who's been had such a difficult start to life because of the Kindertransport.
Well, that's a fantastic note to end on.
Thank you very much.
Monica, are you?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. So I just thought that is, you know, a really great note to end on. I could go on forever. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
but shall we let some of the questions come through now?
Sure.
Absolutely. I'm going to remain invisible. I shall bite my tongue because I have so many questions. Actually, no, I'm going to, I lie. There's one very specific question I would like to put to you, partly because it's not been asked by anybody else yet that I can see. I'm intrigued by your incorporation of the photographs. And I wondered if that was something that came to you in the process of writing or much later, or indeed from the very beginning, and what function you feel they serve.
I took photographs on the trip, and so they just seem to be these key moments for me. And the object of the book changes if there's a photograph on it. I mean, quite a lot of people use photographs. W.G. Sebald, of course, but a lot of writers do use photographs. And I felt that they just augmented the text as far as I could see. So they were there and it really was happening. So I really...
Another comparable example, I think, Jonathan, is a wonderful book that you may indeed already have read that came out recently by George Curtis called The Photographer at 16. He also uses them there. These
really?
sort of grainy, and I think it's the fact that they're black and white, they're grainy, they're not, in a sense, good quality photographs, adds that sense of kind of inaccessibility and mystery, indeed. Right, okay, I'll stop there with my own questions and looking through, they're coming in thick and fast. I'm just going to start with, I think, perhaps the very first one that came in while you were talking, and we've had lots of wonderful responses so far. You'll be glad to know, I'm sure. So yes, Tanya Barnett. So what, Jonathan, changed when you were in your 50s to make it less risky and more bearable to actually make that trip?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think one does change, and I think that there wasn't anything specific. Perhaps my children being slightly older. But I couldn't put a precise, nothing specific happened. One thing I did feel was, if I didn't do it now, I never would. And that was one really important thing to me, that if I was going to have to write this out for my children to explain how mad I was when I was young, I better do it now. And my dad was old. So I think actually that's probably it was now or never, really.
Yes, sorry, can I just say a very practical point? I noticed that some of you, I'm sure with the best intentions, are typing your questions into the chat function. It's much easier for me because I then have to switch between the chat and the Q&A. If you can all make sure that you type your questions in the Q&A function, not the chat section function, that would make my life somewhat simpler. Picking up on that, Jonathan, one thing I've been struck by, I mean, I remember some time ago now, but, you know, I was sort of both relieved and slightly disconcerted to discover that there were many people, a surprising number of people, perhaps like myself, second generation members, who were going through not identical but similar sorts of things in their lives in relation to their parents' experience. I've been in touch with many others, and two questions really. One is that I wonder how fully you were aware in the course of writing this book that there are many other people like you dealing perhaps with their experiences in different but comparable ways. And also the other thing that struck me quite forcibly is that in many cases, particularly in terms of creative responses, whether it's visual artists or writers, very often the person in question somehow has to wait until the parents are no more, they've passed on, before they can do what they do?
Yeah. I wasn't so aware, I wasn't so aware of the large number of people who were going through this, but I had read Anne Karp's wonderful book, and I'd read Stettel, of course. So I was aware, and I'd also seen the film about the Kindertransport. So I was very aware, so I wasn't very aware. As I was writing it, I became aware, and there's a wonderful book called Memory Work, which I mention in my thanks at the end, you know, the acknowledgements, which sums up a lot of what people of second generation are writing. And then, so I then became very aware that I was just part of this second generation who was trying to make sense of this very remarkable group of survivors and contributors to the country we're living in. And so to answer your question, it's been a surprise to me that there were so many people who felt the same way, and a kind of relief, actually, because otherwise you think you're going mad on your own. Turns out you're going mad with loads of other people.
Let me focus on some much more specific questions. Sue Walsh asked, did your father ever think of changing his name? Which of course is a loaded question.
My father said that when he was 13 or 14, he thought of changing his name and felt deeply ashamed at the thought that he thought he was going to change his name, and stuck by Lichtenstein ever since. And he always insisted on that we were Lichtensteins, not Lichtensteins or Lichtensteins. We were the Lichtensteins. So
right. There's another question relating to that, Jonathan, and that is just a very simple one in a way. How old was your father when he came to this country?
12.
12.
He had just turned 12.
Yeah, yeah. A related question from somebody called Monica Goodwin from Naples in Florida. How did you react when you were called a Nazi at school? And were there other Jews in your town? And did you have a traditionally Jewish home? I think one can probably guess.
No, I didn't have a traditionally Jewish home. I had a kind of normal secular experience, but I didn't react very well about being called a Nazi, especially I was hit. But I was very confused. So it was kind of, it's very, how can I say? It was very confusing because my father wouldn't talk about it. So he didn't know.
Can I say something here? Because we mentioned earlier, I had a similar experience. And
how weird.
So it happened to me, I must have been about 9 or 10. It was in primary school. I remember exactly, there was one particular boy who decided that I was a Nazi. And he was saying, you're a Nazi. And I'd been, no, but because I already knew the entire, or, you know, I had a perfectly good understanding of the history and why my parents were in the UK and what had preceded that. But at the time, I have a very strong recollection that British television had every Saturday afternoon these war films with these Tommies. There was never any mention of the Holocaust. So their perception of the Second World War was quite different than mine.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, I was taught by people who'd fought in the Second World War. Of course, you know, shopkeepers had fought in the Second World War. So you're right. And in the 60s, when I was growing up, the Holocaust wasn't known very well. Primo Levi had been published, but not. It wasn't. This is something which we understand. Even the word the Holocaust wasn't really very, you know, an important fabric of society, of the culture. So I think people have really changed on that.
Yeah, but I was left standing there going, no, but you don't understand.
I had to take
That's
people.
wrong.
When I was 13, I explained it, but it was, yeah, you're right. It's just unknowingness, really.
Right, some other quite specific questions which I think help anchor what we've been talking about. Did he come alone? And was there a foster family that took him in?
Yes, he came. My father came alone, and he joined a foster family. But the foster family went back to. They were American, and they left 2 or 3 weeks after he arrived. So he was then on his own, and he survived by going to boarding schools. So he didn't have any parents at all. So it was quite unusual.
A question here from somebody called Amy. I think it might be quite difficult for any of us to answer. Does Jonathan see any differences or similarities between German and British national memories of the Kindertransport? It's an interesting question, but
yeah, it's a really interesting
yeah.
question. I hadn't really thought. I imagine there will be. I imagine there will be. I mean, I think one of the things is the puncturing of the myth of saving, and I think we've all talked about this, that actually a lot of Kindertransport had a lot of difficulties and a lot of agonies, really, and a lot of emotional deprivation. So I don't know, Amy. I'm sorry, I can't answer it clearly enough because I don't know enough about the German idea. I know my grandmother felt she had saved my father, and my father was extremely distressed about what had happened to him. So that's.
Thank you. Various people have asked me to point out to you, to alert you to the fact that there are, but there are a number of support systems of organizations in place. As the Kindertransport Association, I think it's called, but also the Second Generation Network, which is thriving in this country. It is a hot topic, whether we like it or not. There are many of us out there.
I know. It's great. It's great to join you.
So in terms of finding out more, I mean, somebody's got a question here about, I won't read it out because it's not quite appropriate for the present moment, but, you know, sort of how do I find out more? I mean, there are ways of so doing. So, you know, if you do a Google search, you know, you can find out some of these organizations. A rather interesting question here. Yes, here we are. When your father arrived in England, for somebody called Alan M. When your father arrived in England, it would have been a bombardment on his senses. Did he ever recall what he thought of simple things like language, food, for example, white bread compared to rye bread? And which port did he arrive at?
He arrived at Harwich, where we left from, and he then went to Liverpool Street Station, where we went, and he got confused about language, and one of the things he said was that he got extremely frightened by these vans which went round called family butchers, and he thought that these were vans which went round butchering families, and he made that a joke, but he it's not, you know, that's how he had no one to ask, and he'd come from Nazi Germany, so he felt that, so you could see just from that how discombobulated or upset he was, really.
A question from Sue Walsh. Did your father ever look for any other survivors of the Kindertransport who came over with him?
No, my father was very, very, like I said to him, you know, Spielberg, he would speak to you, why don't you just really ought to write it. I'm not writing it down. I'm not writing it down. I'm not interested. You know, he just wasn't interested. And I think, you know, there is a very honourable reason, and it's because it's too painful. And you want to live your life, and he wanted to live his life and not look back. And I think one of the fears is the suicide, and this is a well-known thing that if you do look back too much, you can sink into depression, which you won't get out of. And I think I mentioned this in the book. He says right at the beginning, I don't think I really can come with you because it's a depression I might not get out of. And that's why it was such an act of generosity for him, really, because it was the stakes are very high for him, I think. I mean, they were.
Do you think it was generosity? It's interesting that you used that term. I'm sure on one level, and in part it was, but it was also a way of, I was going to say catharsis, that's a too easily bandied about term, but in a way it was a necessary trip for him to make.
I don't think he really wanted to do it. I think he was doing it for his family and me.
A question here related to that from Yona, Alfred Kromholtz in Israel. Could you detect a change in your father's demeanour as you got closer to Berlin? Was he stoical throughout? Now, if you read the book,
he became very, very, very agitated as we moved to Berlin, extremely upset in Berlin. But then as we left, he quietened. And then when he got home, he could sleep. And he'd never slept. My mother said he's never slept, and then he could sleep. So this was the very moving thing. That's why I start the book saying about sleep and about nightmares, how the nightmares got worse as you head into the darkness, it gets worse, and then you can sleep. So it's an optimistic book in that way. It's a very optimistic book. It's like saying, you know, the alive must do what the dead cannot do. And I think this is a theme in the book, which I mentioned. So he was in many ways very calmed by the whole experience, as was I. You
Another related question from Eva, I think. Did he ever speak German in Berlin during the trip, and how did he react when he heard German?
He did speak German, and he was thrilled because everyone thought he was English. And he was told at the hotel that he spoke German in a very old-fashioned way, as though he was had learnt it from a textbook from the 1930s. So I didn't realise that he actually had learnt German from textbooks in the 1930s, but hadn't spoken much. So his great delight was to be thought of as an Englishman speaking a kind of rather old-fashioned German.
And a question from Amy. Did you visit the Kindertransport Memorial in Berlin? If so, what was that like?
We didn't actually. No. Oh, no, we didn't. No, we didn't. I have, but we didn't. Yeah.
Gaby, do you want to chip in at all or add anything? There've been some interesting questions for sure.
I have one question actually, which I sort of I've mentioned to you before, Jonathan, which I thought there's one thing that as you get into Berlin, you quite often describe your father tucking in with relish into food. Now, to me, food is the archetypal Jewish theme. And there's something about his attitude to food, his approach to food, the relish with which he eats a piece of cake or something, that says to me, I enjoy life and you didn't kill me. Was that something that you felt as well?
I think he relished life, yeah. I mean, I think one of the things, if you go close to death, is that you relish life. And I think this is the other thing we're seeing, you know, we can see this in the outside as inside as outside. The relish of life and the delight of being alive is really, really heightened if you've been through something where life might have been taken away from you. So yeah, I think food, this paragliding, this running, I mean, he was canoeing, he was just, you know, he was delight. He really loved his life and lived it very fully. And I'm sure this is the other side of the trauma, you know, the trauma kind of squeezes you something down, but it also is liberating and enlivening in other ways. And my father really did live an incredibly full life. I mean, he really loved it. He loved all food and most of life.
And he lived a long life, which is, you know, a fabulous thing. He lived a long life.
He lived a long life, yeah.
And from what you said earlier, I think there was something healing between you after you'd come back.
Yes, there was.
Years after you
it was. It was much, much calmer after we came back and much nicer. Yeah. I think we loved each other very much, but we were just different. And I think I was, you know, we had this emotional range which was just different. It didn't overlap very often.
Another question about your Jewish. Sorry, Gaby, go.
I was just saying, no, it's worth reading to sort of appreciate that, because I suppose because I was writing fiction, I don't know, maybe for cowardly reasons, I have given my book, you know, I don't want to give away too much, but a reasonably happy ending.
Yeah.
But I've, you know, maybe in my case, it's like it was the chance, because my mother died when she was young, she was 69.
Yeah.
It was more of a chance to achieve that emotional reconciliation in fiction if I couldn't have it in reality.
Yeah. No, it's very touching you saying that. I was very fortunate, and I can see in your book, your beautiful book, which is dealing with such similar issues, reparation, that your relationship with your mother was attenuated and didn't allow you to work it through. And I think one can almost fictionally work these things through. After all, you're also highly successful, and you know, and you have written this amazingly textured book. And to my mind, Reparation and Berlin Shadow, they're different ways of looking at the same material, really. So and they're both about the living in the shadows of a very vibrant person, because your mum was so incredibly alive too. I mean, that's what it comes across in the book.
Oh, she was. I mean, she was a very talented person, and that's a sort of almost frustration that a lot of that got lost for various reasons, because she really fell apart emotionally as she got older, and there was a particular reason for that, which I don't really go into in the book. But
you certainly allude to a reason, and but I think I don't know, you probably get this, the book sort of writes itself really, doesn't it? You have a certain amount of control about what you write, but you actually, the book sort of writes itself, I think. I felt I didn't really have that much say over the material I was focusing on. I just felt I've got to do this and it's just in front of me and I've got to do it. So.
A cluster of related questions. Well, I think we need to probably keep half an eye on the time.
Yeah.
The place of Jewishness, Judaism, both in your childhood, but also another related question, knowing what your father went through, how important is Judaism to you now or to you yourself? And then also a question about your mother's background, which presumably was quite different. And also a question about what happened to the rest of his family, who survived, who didn't.
That's a lot of questions.
That's a lot of questions.
Yeah. Shall we go? Could you just go through them?
Yes, perhaps start about the role of Judaism, the sense of Jewishness in your own childhood.
I think it's something, that I'm, extraordinarily proud of my Jewish heritage. And I think my father was complicated about it. And I think that's taken a lot of working through really for him and for me. So I think he arrived having been violated because of his Jewishness, and I think that became quite complicated for him. And my mum's from North London; she wasn't caught up in the Holocaust at all. So Jewishness is incredibly important to me.
But your mother is Jewish, or not?
I'll talk to you in more detail about that later. It's a fascinating story, but I'll talk to you about it.
All right, fine. I'm just scanning.
There's another question, wasn't there?
Oh yes, about what happened to other members of his family.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, a lot of cousins, most people, some of his immediate family survived. His sister survived. His mother survived. And his grandmother survived. The rest of the family died, and the book goes into that.
I suspect we'd better stop there. There are so many more things that could be said. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank both of you so much.
Thank you everyone for listening.
I'm going to read, Jonathan, I'm going to read one last, well, it's not a question, it's something that somebody called Cheryl has written, sharing everybody in the message. Okay, a good place to end with this. I have had the privilege and the pleasure of reading Jonathan's book recently and can only recommend it as a really insightful, beautiful journey that is written brilliantly and which is genuinely a study on timeless human relationships and their infinite capacity for resilience and love. Congratulations, Jonathan.
Well, thank you very much. Lovely. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for your lovely questions, Gaby, and thank you, Monica, for giving me the chance to do this.
It's a very great pleasure, and thank all of you. Well over 100 of you have been listening in, I think, intensely and sort of with great concentration and with some wonderful questions coming our way. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much.
See some of you on future occasions. All the very best.
Goodbye, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Bye. Thank you so much, Gaby. Take care. Bye. Bye.